大家好。
Good afternoon. Mr. Yao, the Secretary, will deliver his opening remarks in both Chinese and English before he takes questions. Mr. Yao. Members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. With respect to the new requirement on original marking for Hong Kong products announced by the U.S. In August, the SAR government formally launches procedures in accordance with the World Trade Organization dispute settlement mechanism against the U.S. measures. Our permanent representatives to the WTO has sent to the U.S. permanent representative to the WTO today our request for formal bilateral consultations with the U.S. on this new requirement under the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. I've also written to the U.S. Trade Representative informing the U.S. that the Hong Kong SAR has officially taken action against the U.S. under WTO mechanism. You may recall that on the 16th of September, the SAR government formally took issue of the U.S. government, requesting that the requirement to be withdrawn immediately. We took the action in accordance with the spirit and practices of the WTO, with a view to resolving the matter with the U.S. through bilateral discussion prior to formal WTO dispute settlement. However, the U.S. has not made any substantive response to the Hong Kong SAR's government's strong objection and request for withdrawal of the requirement. The U.S. has so far not withdrawn the requirement. In the past few weeks, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices in Washington, D.C. and Geneva have been following up with the matter with relevant U.S. agencies. The Hong Kong ETO in Washington, D.C. met with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the Office of the United States Trade Representative, respectively, but to no avail. We have expressed our position and asked that the requirement be withdrawn. Meanwhile, at the WTO General Council meeting held on October the 13th and two other WTO meetings, our permanent representative clearly expressed that we are strongly against the U.S. new requirement and reiterated that the new requirement disregards Hong Kong's status as a separate member of the WTO. This requirement also undermines the rules-based multilateral trading system and clearly violate WTO origin rules. However, the U.S. representative to the WTO has not made any concrete response. As we said on the 16th of September, if the U.S. disregards our request, then we have no choice but to take further action against the U.S. on the multilateral level in order to safeguard our interests. The response by the U.S. in the past 6 weeks have been disappointing, and it's necessary for us to take further action. According to a WTO mechanism, the U.S. shall respond to Hong Kong's request for consultations within 10 days and conduct consultations with Hong Kong within 30 days. If the two parties fail to resolve the dispute through consultations within 60 days, the Hong Kong SAR government has the right to take further action and will certainly request the dispute settlement body to establish a panel to consider the dispute. As a responsible WTO member, Hong Kong has always abided by the WTO rules. The U.S. new requirement undermined Hong Kong's separate customs territory status, conferred through the Basic Law, a basic principle under one country, two systems. We will robustly advance our arguments to defend Hong Kong's interests.
With respect to the new requirement on origin marking for Hong Kong products announced by the U.S. in August, the Hong Kong SAR government today formally launches procedures in accordance with the World Trade Organization dispute settlement mechanism against the U.S. measures. Our permanent representative to the WTO has sent the U.S. representative today our request for formal bilateral consultation with the U.S. on this new requirement under the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. I've also written to the U.S. Trade Representative informing the U.S. that the Hong Kong SAR has officially taken action against the U.S. under the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. You may recall that the SAR government formally took issue with the US government on September 16, requesting that the requirement to be withdrawn immediately. We took the action in accordance with the spirit and practices of the WTO, with a view to resolving the matter with the US through bilateral discussion prior to formal WTO dispute settlement. However, the US has not made any substantive response to SAR government's strong objection and request for withdrawal of the requirement. And the US has so far not withdrawn this new origin marking requirement. In the past few weeks, the Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices in Washington, D.C. and Geneva have been following up the matter with the relevant US agencies. Our Economic and Trade Office in Washington, D.C. has met with US Customs and Border Protection and also the Office of the USTR, but to no avail. At the same time, at the WTO General Council meeting held on October 13, our permanent representative clearly expressed that we strongly object to the new US origin marking requirements and reiterate that the new requirement disregards Hong Kong's status as a separate member of WTO. And the US origin requirement also undermines the rules-based multilateral trading system, not to mention that they are clearly violating WTO origin rules. Unfortunately, the US representative to WTO has not made any concrete response. Now, given the disappointing response of the US in the past 6 weeks, it is necessary for the Hong Kong government to take further action against the US on the multilateral front. According to WTO mechanism, the US shall respond to Hong Kong's request for consultation within 10 days and conduct consultation with Hong Kong within 30 days. If two parties fail to resolve the dispute through consultation within 60 days, the Hong Kong SL government has the right, and we will take further action, to request the dispute settlement body to establish a panel to consider the dispute. As a responsible WTO member, Hong Kong always abides by WTO rules, and the US new requirement undermines Hong Kong's separate customs territory status conferred to us through the Basic Law, which is a basic principle under one country, two systems. We will therefore robustly defend Hong Kong's interests. 我樂意解答大家嘅問題。
I'm happy to take questions from members. Well, before you ask questions, please identify yourself and the organization you represent, and you can only ask 3 questions at most. I'm from RTHK. Now, after the mechanism is formally activated, what will be the outcome? Now, if the mechanism agrees that Hong Kong is more justified, will the U.S. have to withdraw those requirements? And how are we going to deal with the issue of the source of origin? Well, Hong Kong and the U.S. are both members of WTO. We should both respect WTO rules. Under WTO rules and under the dispute resolution settlement mechanism, we request consultations with the U.S. As I said, there are established procedures under the mechanism. If during the period the U.S. did not give us a formal and reasonable response to the fact that we can resolve the issue properly, we will ask that a dispute settlement body be set up. A panel should be set up under the body. Recently, the EU and the US have got a panel set up to deal with the dispute over steel and aluminum. And the other example is the U.S. Claim against 301, and then the panel ruled that the U.S. had breached WTO rules, and that is what the mechanism can do.
In the end, we hope that we don't need to take that step, but then in accordance with the rules of the WTO, these are the rights of Hong Kong, and we will actively pursue that. And under the new requirement, by the 9th of November, to be more correct, in fact, that will take effect starting from the 10th of November. And starting from then, well, whatever is to be exported to the US will be affected if we're talking about exports. And in Hong Kong, there are manufacturers who are taking different measures in order to circumvent that rule. And even if the amount is not that great, it's less than 0.1% of our total exports, still there would be effect. And also for the US exports into Hong Kong, there would also be inconvenience cost, and there are also confusions because there are certain ambiguities. That's the reason why we have to resolve it. All right, the one in blue on the third row from the left-hand side. I'm from Now TV, Secretary. Well, according to your estimate, how long will it take for the process to be completed? So within 60 days, between Hong Kong and the US, if you're not able to resolve that, and by the time when you have to set up a panel. So after the setting up of a panel, when will that be resolved? And between now and then, does that mean that Hong Kong manufacturers will have to follow the US rule? In other words, they will have to stick the Made in China sticker to the products, and also because the US presidential election is going to take place in a few days' time. So have you estimated the outcome and how it's going to affect the bilateral negotiation between Hong Kong and the US? Because what if Donald Trump wins? Then will that mean that the US attitude towards Hong Kong would become even firmer? Or if Joe Biden wins, then would that become more optimistic? Well, as I said, under the dispute resolution or settlement mechanism, there are certain timelines as I've spelled out. And if indeed we have to set up a panel, then that would depend on when the panel can be set up, and also when it can convene the first meeting and when a ruling can be made, and there is also an appeal mechanism. So for the time being, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment, but then we will have to go through the established procedures, and we will have to follow and respect that mechanism. And you talk about the presidential election. Well, Hong Kong and US relations are not built on a particular individual or a particular government, because the bilateral relationship is a reciprocal one and is also mutually beneficial. And we're not talking about the biggest trade surplus that the US enjoys with Hong Kong. But then if that relationship is undermined, in particular, as far as the business sector and also the consumers are concerned, they would also be harmed. And I don't think that needs any further explanation. And in fact, between Hong Kong and the US, for a long while, the current situation has already caused a lot of negative impact, in particular for US import into Hong Kong and also Hong Kong exports to Hong Kong. There has been a decline. And also for the trade surplus that the US has enjoyed for a long while, that has also come down by some 20%. So I think between Hong Kong and the US, the relationship is not built on a particular government. We have to establish it on a basis of mutually beneficial, and also the fact that we are both member of the WTO, and we have to respect those rules. Yes, the lady in black. Yes, I'm from Ming Pao Daily. Well, I'd like to ask, well, under this mechanism, after it is activated, for the US requirement, will that continue to be effective? In other words, Hong Kong manufacturers will have to follow that for the time being. And secondly, is it the first time that Hong Kong has activated the dispute settlement mechanism? And the third question is about under the dispute settlement mechanism, Hong Kong is asking that the US withdraw that totally, or is it that they would allow us to continue to use the Made in Hong Kong sticker? Well, before a ruling is made, if the US insists on their current rule, that would jeopardize our trade. In other words, Hong Kong exports will be affected. That's the reason why we are taking it so seriously. That's why through various channels we are trying to resolve that. And your third question relates to what I said earlier, in particular from the sector. Earlier on, we have also talked to the US Customs and Border Protection. There are some interim measures. For example, we are both WTO members, and on this issue, without affecting Hong Kong exports, we made certain suggestions, but regrettably, they have not taken on board any of those suggestions. And therefore, we are trying to protect Hong Kong's rights under the WTO. And secondly, we also have to ensure that Hong Kong's business interests would also be protected. As to whether or not this is the first time ever, well, since the reunification, for Hong Kong to take the initiative to complain against another WTO member, yes, that's the first time. But then 2 years ago, I referred to another case involving the U.S. in 2018, because in 2018, with regard to steel and aluminium, there was certain tariff imposed on other exporters from the world, and that was taken by the U.S. And some WTO members were also against it. And Hong Kong, as a third party, also took part in that petition. But then the status was somewhat different. But then for Hong Kong to formally lodge a complaint against the U.S., this is indeed the first time. Yes? The lady in black on the right-hand side.
Since the U.S. Is considering withdrawing from the WTO, do you think that any decisions, any rulings from the WTO will be binding on the U.S.?
I have not seen any concrete action for U.S. being the world's largest trading entity to withdraw from the most important multilateral trading organization. Although I pick up news saying from time to time they're flat to say that, well, they may not necessarily be sort of staying on if some rules may not be in their favor. But I don't think that's a responsible way of sort of taking part in multilateral trading organization like the WTO. Because, well, that's the single most important member-driven organization, which all members, 164, sitting together to come up with rules that all members had agreed to and promised to abide by it. So it's a very important commitment for every single member. WTO is a very consensus-based organization. It's nothing that the rules would be imposed on one or another. All the rules were in fact sort of proposed, discussed, and agreed by all members. And therefore, it is every obligation for every member to abide by them.
我哋答多條英文問題，右手邊第四項。
All right, one more English question. On the right-hand side, the lady in red.
Okay, just now you didn't really say explicitly whether the Hong Kong manufacturers are still required to label as made in China before U.S. response. Can you respond to this question? You only say that the export will be affected. And second question is that, do you think that your move will take too long to see an effect? Because it takes years to take effect if a panel is set up and the ruling is out. And the third question is, will you ask the mainland China to help give pressure on the U.S. to give a response, and why?
Yeah, the first question, of course, the U.S. is unilaterally imposing this new requirement without any valid reason and with blatant sort of violation of WTO rules on Hong Kong. And that's why we have to sort of fight against the U.S. under the WTO organization, WTO sort of dispute settlement mechanism. For the time being, if the U.S. would continue to proceed with this requirement as they claim to take effect on November 10th, yes, Hong Kong export will be affected. And at the same time, I think U.S. import will also be affected too. Your second question, I think, of course, WTO dispute settlement would take time, but it's also a very important step, an important sort of a procedure that members' rights, including Hong Kong's, are being protected. So I think we are focusing on to what extent we should sort of use this mechanism to protect our own rights. And as WTO members, we take it very seriously, any violation of such rules by other members. So this is not just Hong Kong's interest, but it's also the interest of all other members within this multilateral trading system. Your last question, basic law conferred to Hong Kong our separate custom territory and also a high degree of autonomy including and in particular in the trade and custom territory. Therefore, it is a matter that Hong Kong can handle on our own. And also, being a separate and independent member of WTO, Hong Kong has this right in our own hand, and that's why we are taking this up in our own right with WTO against the US. Thank you.
時間關係，我哋答多2條問題。
In the interest of time, we'll only take 2 more questions. I'm from Commercial Radio. Can you please clarify? Because you've just started the mechanism, however, the requirement is already enforced. What will be the government's advice for manufacturers exporting from Hong Kong to the US? Should they follow the requirement? And then there was already one postponement in your consultations with the US. Will you ask for another postponement pending further discussions? And have you included that in your discussion with the US? And this is the first time the Hong Kong SAR government has invoked this mechanism. Have you ever informed the main authorities that the Hong Kong government is going to go down this route? Will there be any sanctions against the US from the central authorities? Will there be countermeasures? Regarding the new requirement on origin marking, it has yet to come into force. At first, it was to come into effect in 45 days, but another 45 days have been added, and so the deadline is the 9th of November. And that's why, in the interim, we've been discussing with various bodies of the US, in particular the US Customs and Border Protection, to ask whether there can be alternatives. And then the sector, many exporters and importers of the US have asked the US government to clarify under what circumstances can the made in Hong Kong mark be used, because this involves a very important rule of WTO, because under the WTO rule on source of origin, there can be no misrepresentation when it comes to the source of origin. So certainly this has been done. However, the US has not withdrawn its requirement or rectified its requirement. This is not a diplomatic issue. Rather, under Articles 115, 116, and 152 of the Basic Law, this is trade and separate customs territory status conferred to us, and so this is something we can act on our own. And because Hong Kong is a separate customs territory, we have been an independent member of the WTO. So there's no need for us to rely on other members' assistance. We can deal with it in the capacity of the Hong Kong SAR government. But of course, the country supports Hong Kong, and after all, this is something conferred through the Basic Law on Hong Kong. Now, before the implementation on the 9th of November, during the window period, will the made in China mark be used instead? That will depend on the position of the US. Last question. I'm from cable TV. Now, if there's no response from the US, what will be the Hong Kong SAR government's advice to manufacturers? Should they use the Made in Hong Kong mark for the time being? And what measures does the government have to assist manufacturers? Should this mark be used? And meanwhile, what can WTO do? WTO is a bilateral trade body, and each member has its rights and obligations. One of the main functions of WTO is to assist In this way, when there are trade disputes between members, then there is a dispute settlement mechanism to help both parties to resolve. Failing that, a panel can be set up to consider the issues, and there is also an appeal mechanism. This is a mechanism accepted and recognized by all parties. Hong Kong will make use of this mechanism because each case can be a precedent for members of WTO to rely on and to invoke. So each and every case is important. At this stage, indeed, it is a bit difficult. When it comes to your first question, as a member of the WTO, Hong Kong SL government will not advise our manufacturers to make any declaration on the source of origin against WTO rules. Of course, manufacturers should consider what is the best way to do it to ensure that their exports can comply with various requirements. So during the period, ourselves, the Trade Development Council and Chambers of Commerce have discussed with WTO to see how they can comply with WTO rules and to comply with our own requirements. The position of Hong Kong is clearly stated. This is not just about the limited volume of exports to the U.S., but it's also about Hong Kong's rights under WTO. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attendance.